The global lockdown and restrictions have created a situation in which women at risk of abuse may feel like they no longer have a way out. Here's a look at some of these statistics from around the world. Now, the French government has offered to pay for hotel rooms for domestic violence victims after reports of abuse jumped by 36% since the lockdown began. 2 women have been murdered. India saw abuse cases double in the first week of restrictions on movement nationwide. That's according to the National Commission for Women. In Australia, internet searches for domestic violence support networks rose by 75%. The National Domestic Abuse Helpline in the UK has experienced a 25% increase in calls and online requests since the lockdown came in. And Tunisia's Women's Affairs Minister says abuse cases have gone up at 5 times the usual rate since a curfew was imposed in March. Well, Lee Giordano is Director of Training at Men Stopping Violence. He joins us on Skype from Atlanta, Georgia. Thank you for your time. So we are talking now about violence primarily against women while under lockdown. How do you do your job, engage with men to end violence against women during this time?
Yeah. Well, first, thank you for having me on this morning. So our job has become a little bit more complicated now that we're all working virtually. Many of our programs, our intervention programs with men who have used abusive behavior are now transitioning and being conducted virtually in online classes, as well as our general engagement effort. So our mission at Men Stopping Violence is to engage communities and men to take action to end violence against women. And so basically, we're now a virtual engagement organization.
But I guess it's going to be difficult or perhaps impossible, isn't it, to reach those households that are under lockdown that haven't engaged with anyone before. It's going to be difficult to reach those people. This is quite an unusual time with a global pandemic.
Absolutely, yeah. There's a combination of dynamics right now that are increasing rates of domestic violence. So we know that stress levels have gone up. People are financially strained. People are losing their jobs. People's normal lives are being disrupted. But we also know that when isolation, when victims are isolated, they have less recourse, and so instances of violence go up. We also know that when there isn't a consequence for an abuser's use of violence, then they can abuse with impunity. And I think that is what is happening now. The abused person isn't able to get out a call for help because the abuser is always there with them.
How
in a quarantine cell.
How do we include the male perspective? I mean, when I saw we were speaking to someone from Men Stopping Violence, it sort of raised my eyebrows because I'm interested in how do you think we include the male perspective and the male role when talking about violence against women without shifting the focus away from women's voices, from women's stories, from women's experiences who are primarily the victims?
Well, we have to acknowledge that if women are primarily the victim, then it is likely that men are primarily the perpetrators. But most men are not perpetrators of violence. But most men also are not taking responsibility for helping to end or reduce the occurrences of violence. So our message to men is, even if you're not one who's engaged in abusive or controlling behavior, you have a responsibility in your community to take action, to speak up, to confront men in your community who may be engaging in those behaviors. One of the things that we're offering currently is resources and help over the phone so that anyone who's using abuse can call us and we can help with tools or options. Anyone who knows someone who is using abuse can call us and we can help them think about how they may intervene or have a conversation with that man. So it is an issue that primarily affects women, but men have a huge role that they could be playing if they were willing to step up. And that's really the goal of our organization is helping men to do that.
Thank you for your time there, Lee Giordano, Director of Training at Men Stopping Violence.
Thank you.
Kavita Krishnan is an activist and secretary of the All India Progressive Women's Association. She joins us on Skype from New Delhi. Thank you for your time. Just tell us, what are you seeing in India? Hundreds of women are reaching out. Put that in perspective for us.
The lockdown was announced without any warning. So India had warning of the approaching COVID-19 crisis since January 30th. But the government did not tell people that any lockdown might be in the offing. And they suddenly announced this 21-day lockdown. That has left a lot of women who suffer domestic violence taken by surprise. So they have not been able to secure themselves or to leave the homes. So they find themselves trapped with their abuser in many cases. And I think that the number of cases must be much higher than what the National Commission of Women is talking about, because India does not have any national hotline or any state-level hotline for domestic violence survivors. So this is a very bad situation. And there's also other things compounding the situation, which is in India in general, even when there is no lockdown, the tendency for the police and other government authorities to take domestic violence very lightly, or to make excuses for it, or to ask the woman complainant to go back to the house of the abuser and not expect any help, is extremely common. And now clearly it is more common. I mean, I only can speak from anecdotal experience because of my own organization's experience in dealing with domestic violence calls during the lockdown. And I can tell you that the pressures, it's explosive. It's an explosive situation, because there are tremendous tensions because of the lockdown. So loss of work, loss of survival resources, greater domestic burdens on women who are dealing with this household situation where there is less food and it's more difficult to survive. And in that situation, abusive men have tended to take it out on women inside the household, especially husbands against wives. And so this is an extremely concerning situation.
So
yes.
What are the options then for women in India who need help?
Very few options exist as of now, because in general, it's like what Ms. Ocasio-Cortez says in the US, that the pandemic has poured gasoline on our existing troubles. So India in general has very poor domestic violence, help. So we do have a law against domestic violence, and there are supposed to be respondents to help women who are in trouble. But we have no shelters. So the state-run shelters tend to be viewed as jails by the women. So their women are not treated well there. And so we basically have very little public spending on shelters in general, or in other forms of help. And in this lockdown situation, naturally, the kind of help and resources have gone down, because here, even if you need and I say this from experience, even if you need an ambulance in a hurry for someone who is suddenly ill, you can't get it in the city of Delhi, which is India's capital city. All right. Now, just imagine, what women have gone through when they have had trouble. If they call the police say, "What is this? We are in the middle of this pandemic, and you're complaining about a quarrel with your husband? Don't bother." So recently, some feminists put out a little video explainer in India about domestic. This was prior to the lockdown, about how the police tend to play down domestic violence and make excuses for it. And this is again something which is all the more exacerbated during the lockdown.
A lot of work to be done. Thank you for your time, Kavita Krishnan from the All India Progressive Women's Association.